Today, we live not in a world of narrow trading blocks, but in a world in which nations are interconnected around the globe as never before. That world is set to continue and to expand. The British people must be free to use their ingenuity and their enterprise to be at the heart of that world. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have three outstanding speakers who will set out their vision of our country's future. Firstly, Peter Lilley. Peter is one of our most far-sighted parliamentarians. If our Prime Minister had wanted to achieve the best Brexit possible, she could have appointed on day one as Brexit Secretary Peter Lilley. Peter has a mastery of this subject. Since he's negotiated as Margaret Thatcher's Trade Secretary the Uruguay Round, which created the World Trade Organization as it is today. Not only would our Prime Minister have had a minister with undoubted expertise, but the rest of the government could have functioned as normal. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union could have reported regularly to the Cabinet on the progress of the negotiations, as Peter Carrington did in Margaret Thatcher's Cabinet. Instead, we have had chaos and confusion, with a Europhile civil servant sharing with the Prime Minister alone the intricacies of these negotiations. It just isn't good enough. Peter not only has tremendous expertise in these matters, as evidenced by his recent publication, Fact Not Fiction. Fiction, I said. Fiction, yeah. He's got a subtitle to it, Exploding the Myths of Leaving the Customs Union. But he also has immense political experience, not only as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, but as Secretary of State for Social Security, Shadow Chancellor and Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. If we'd been in government rather than opposition, he would have made a great reforming Chancellor. But even more important than his expertise, he has the ability to defy convention. He told MPs that since the EU made 80% of our laws, they should take a pay cut to reflect their diminished role. He was one of only 3 MPs to vote against the Climate Change Act. Pointing out during the debate, it was only October, but it was snowing outside. When he last spoke to us 2 years ago, he was one of the first to refer to the Eagles' hit, Hotel California, which he likened to leaving the EU. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And with some foresight to another line, we are just prisoners here of our own device. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome, as warmly as possible, the Right Honourable Peter Lilley.
Thank you very much. I remember very well the day Mrs. Thatcher gave the Bruges speech, after which this organisation is named. I was attending the Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting on your behalf and at your expense in Cyprus when the news came over the tapes that she'd made this speech, and all the Commonwealth ministers surrounded me and said, "What does it mean?" All these ministers representing former colonies and dominions. And I said, surely it's obvious to you. It's about us trying to get our independence back. I wonder whether any of them would have dreamt that in the process of getting our independence back, we'd have volunteered to pay £39 billion for the privilege. Would any of them? That we would have spent 2 years begging and pleading and conceding and giving way to reach this appalling agreement. Now, I'm not actually going to talk much about the agreement because I think my colleagues will tell you how appalling it is if you don't know already. I want to consider what happens if and when Parliament votes it down, as I hope it will. And I believe the government then should pursue a twin-track policy, simultaneously trying to renegotiate so that we can take up President Tusk's offer that he made on the 7th of March this year of a Canada plus deal extended to the whole United Kingdom. But while we're doing that, in case they won't negotiate or those negotiations cannot be brought to a fruitful conclusion by the 29th of March, we simultaneously plan for WTO plus. Now, renegotiating the withdrawal agreement so that we can take up the Canada plus option means scrapping the Irish protocol and replacing it by a commitment by the British government, the European Union and the Irish government that under no circumstances will they erect infrastructure or carry out customs and other checks on the border. All of them individually have said that in the event of no deal, they will not erect infrastructure and carry out checks on the border. So let's have a commitment to that end, and then the whole paraphernalia of backstops and backstops to backstops disappears. And opens the way to us having a straight free trade agreement, which, as President Tusk himself said, is logically the only sort of agreement that we can have if, as we have pledged, we want to leave the customs union and the single market. So that's one strand of the government's approach, should be seeking a renegotiation of that kind. And another key feature of it would be that any financial commitment be made conditional on reaching such a free trade agreement. No deal, no money. The second track, which must be pursued simultaneously, not afterwards, not wait to see whether they'll come back and agree to renegotiate, is what I call WTO plus. That will involve us completing the preparations that are being made, and which actually are rather more advanced than I thought when I began looking at this, for leaving without a withdrawal agreement. Encouraging and persuading and informing businesses how they can prepare in the remaining months for a WTO plus agreement and trading on World Trade Organization terms. Inviting the EU to coordinate their efforts and preparations for a no withdrawal agreement outcome with our own. Actually, they are much further advanced in those preparations than many imagine. And in some respects, they are cooperating and doing things which complement what we're doing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We should, of course, immediately guarantee and legislate to guarantee the rights of European citizens who are already here. They are our neighbours, our workmates, our friends. We don't want to cause them any prolonged uncertainty. And we should begin the process of novating or renegotiating the trade deals that we are party to as part of the European Union, where the European Union has free trade agreements and we want to continue to trade freely with those countries. Some portray it as a daunting task. There are supposedly 70 countries, if you count San Marino, Morocco, and Monaco and places like that. Most of them are rather small. But actually it's a less daunting task when you look at it. One single country, Switzerland, accounts for 50% of our trade under those agreements. The agreement with Switzerland, as I understand from speaking to someone at the Swiss embassy a little while ago, well, if I said, surely we could make some progress before we actually leave with this agreement. He said, but didn't you know we have 8 work streams, 5 of them complete, 3 are nearly complete. I understand that that agreement ought, according to the Swiss, to be complete before too long. That accounts for half the trade. Another 3 countries bring it up to 80% of the trade. That's South Korea, Turkey and Norway. So 4 agreements could settle the bulk of that trade, and most of the others are very keen to do likewise. Indeed, no single country has said that they don't want to negotiate with us, though one important country has said, what's the point until we know when you're going to leave, when you're going to have your own independent trade policy, and that you definitely are going to be outside of the customs union. You can't really blame them for that. Now, what are the pluses? Why is it WTO +++ rather than just World Trade Organization terms? Well, first of all, we keep £39 billion to spend on our priorities, to boost both our balance of payments and GDP. Those extra resources are equivalent to roughly 2% of our GDP over the next couple of years. Far from crashing out, we'd be cashing in. And whenever you hear anyone talk about crashing out, just say, no, we are cashing in £39 billion. What are you going to get for your £39 billion on your favoured Remainer-type option? Secondly, it ends uncertainty. The agreement the Prime Minister has negotiated perpetuates uncertainty for another 2 years or more. Even if companies don't necessarily favour this particular outcome, and there'll be some who benefit more than others and so on, everybody, once they know, will get on and invest to deal with problems and take advantage of opportunities. That pent-up uncertainty will be released. Thirdly, it will force the European and Irish governments, both of whom, as I said, like the British government, have said that they would cope without erecting infrastructure and having checks on the border, to do precisely that. So the Irish border problem would solve itself. And that brings the 4th plus, of my 3 pluses, that we would be in a much better position, to negotiate a Canada-style free trade agreement with the EU from a position of strength, the Irish border issue having solved itself, and us no longer being bound by the time schedules of Article 50. Now, there are advantages, of course, that apply to both the Canada +++ and the WTO +++ options, particularly once we're in charge of our own destiny and outside the customs union, we can abolish tariffs, particularly on goods we don't produce. Tariffs which force British consumers and businesses to subsidise inefficient producers on the continent. Instead, we'll be able to buy cheaper elsewhere, often from developing countries, helping them trade out of poverty. And we should start consulting now on what our tariff schedules should be, which we're going to eliminate, which we're going to reduce, and which we may want to keep. Secondly, of course, we'll be immediately able to negotiate trade deals with a range of countries who've indicated a willingness to do so. 90% of future trade growth, according to the European Commission's own trade portal, will be outside the EU. So that's where we should be looking for growth in future. And above all, and we often forget this, the real fruit is that we'll be able to streamline our regulation, maintaining high standards, but reducing the burden of compliance on our businesses and removing barriers to entry, which very often EU regulation imposes. So, although the media often portray the WTO option as something frightening and catastrophic, in fact, the WTO was designed to provide, and I know because I was, as Barry said, involved in the negotiations that set it up, It was designed to provide the basic framework within which countries would trade safely. It's a safe haven with guarantee that you'll be free from discrimination by other countries. They can't impose punitive taxes on you. They must offer you the most favoured nation tariff, the tariff they offer to other trading partners, except in events that they have trade deals with people. So we guarantee the most favoured nation terms, and it provides a dispute resolution procedure. The important thing to realise is that our trade with countries with which we trade solely on WTO terms has risen 3 times as fast as our trade with a single market since that was established. Now, I was responsible for both. I was involved in setting up the deep WTO. I was also the Secretary of State who had to introduce the whole single market programme. And I made extravagant claims and boasts about how wonderful each would be. It turns out, however, that my claims about the extra growth in trade that would come from the single market were much more extravagant than those I made about the extra trade we get from the WTO. So we shouldn't be too worried about that. Now, if we are on WTO terms, we will face tariffs. We'll face the common external tariff when we trade with Europe. And of course, if we keep their tariffs, they'll face the same tariffs coming to us. Well, what will that mean? Our exports would incur some £5 to £6 billion of tariffs on them going to Europe. That's equivalent to an average tariff of about 4%. Much less than the near 15% improvement in competitiveness which our exporters have enjoyed vis-à-vis Europe since the referendum because of the exchange rate movement over that period. So they'll still be, on average, considerably better off. It's also much less than our net membership fee of the European Union, which is 10 to 12 billion. Now, some people suggest it's worth paying to have access to the single market. But to pay 10 billion to save 5 billion does not strike me as a rational deal. And it's what we've been doing for the last 43 years. By contrast, if we apply the existing tariff to imports from the EU, they will have to pay not 5 or 6 billion as we'll have to pay, but 13 billion. Why so much? 2 reasons. One, they export far more to us than we export to them. And secondly, the goods that they tend to export to us are the most protected, those which operate within the high tariff walls that Europe surrounds itself with, like motor cars, food, clothing, and so on. So we will be free to buy those goods more cheaply elsewhere. I hope we will reduce our tariffs, particularly on things that we don't produce, but keeping some so that overall, for example, our agriculture faces no increase in obstacles worldwide, but nonetheless there's still some obstacle to the Europeans coming into this country with their goods. So, and we'd still, if we do slash our tariffs, be left with plenty of money to support those industries which will be, at least in the short term, hardest hit by facing European tariffs. Now, I've been looking at some of the scare stories which have been going around about what trading on WTO terms will involve. The extraordinary thing is most of them involve the alleged problems we will face at importing things into this country from Europe, medicines, food, and so on. It is bizarre to assume that we are going to put obstacles in the way of things we want coming into this country. We're not going to do so, we will not do so. In fact, we're not going to put any new obstacles in the way of anything coming into this country. That may be a surprise to you, but that is what the head of the Customs and Excise has repeatedly told select committees. It doesn't get reported by the BBC or others because it sort of doesn't tie in with their game plan. But the Customs and Excise only carry out physical checks if there's some reason to do so. The reason may be because the customs computer chief, it's called, customs handling import and export for the use of, for something chief, that analyses any customs declaration and works out whether there's something fishy about it. Is this product really coming from a place where they do lots of drugs and don't produce really the things they're claiming to import? And it identifies roughly 1% of all consignments coming into the country from outside the European Union as worthy of checks. In addition, there's sometimes direct intelligence which they get that they know about a particular smuggler or crook. What are we looking for? We're looking, among other for drugs, for dutiable goods like tobacco and alcohol being smuggled into this country without paying that duty, and illegal immigrants. None of those will change. The riskiness of any consignment coming from the continent having an illegal immigrant abroad won't change. Having tobacco or cigarettes or alcohol there won't change. So they do not anticipate any increase in the number of checks at our borders. So it is complete nonsense to suppose that there are going to be great hold-ups on stuff coming in. Now what about stuff going out to through Calais to France and the continent? Well, first of all, a third of the lorries going back are empty, I hate to tell you, because we export so much less than we import. So there's not too much problem for them handling empty lorries coming back. But I've been looking at what our partners on the continent are planning to do. And they're taking very sensible and vigorous precautions. Going through the French Parliament at the moment, it's gone through the Senate, it's now in the National Assembly, is a piece of legislation which empowers the French government to take all necessary act. First of all, to secure the rights of British citizens in France. They're going ahead and doing it, like I say we should be doing conversely for European citizens here. But also to take all necessary action to ensure the smooth flow of goods and the rights of British firms established in France and their subsidiaries and so on. So they're taking all that necessary action. And the minister concerned, Gérald Darmanin, is going around saying we've got to do this, because if we don't, we'll lose trade to ports up the coast, Zeebrugge, Antwerp and Rotterdam. And the prefect for the Hauts-de-France region around Calais said it will be economic suicide for them, deliberately or through lack of preparation, to allow bottlenecks to develop at Calais. So they're doing all they can. The French government is acquiring a scanner which will be able to scan trains going into the tunnel, even when they're moving at 30 kilometers an hour. So we shouldn't assume that that our partners on the continent are out to get us. They know that getting us will cost them a lot, and by and large, they are law-abiding people. Indeed, one of the problems we have with the European Union is essentially it's a construction of laws. It's a legal entity. It's far harder for them, actually, I mean, they do succeed from time to time, to do things which are illegal than it is for us, if we want to.
We're British.
Well, we don't, of course, but we could easily pass an act of Parliament in Labour's to do almost anything we wanted to. They find it much more difficult and are very unlikely to do so. So then there's both on imports and exports things right. Now what about aeroplanes? We heard an awful lot about aeroplanes not being allowed to fly. What you won't have heard, because you're reliant on the BBC and other people for your news, is that the European Commission issued a paper on the 13th of November, so obviously it's taken a little time to get through to the news desks, saying, regarding traffic rights, the Commission will propose measures to ensure that air carriers from the United Kingdom are allowed to fly over the territory of the European Union, make stops as well as land in the European Union and fly back to the United Kingdom. Those measures will be subject to condition that the United Kingdom applies equivalent measures to air carriers from the European Union. Very sensible measure. It's going to be resolved. As far as aviation safety is concerned, where components and whatnot on planes and everything have to be certified, the Commission will propose measures ensuring continued validity of such certificates. Certificates are offered before we leave for a limited period of time, to give us time to set up appropriate validating bodies out there. And likewise, the Commission will propose measures ensuring that parts and appliances placed on the Union market before the withdrawal date their certificates are recognised and so on. You'll be pleased to know this if you're planning to go on holiday and carrying lots of baggage, going to operate the system that will prevent, because just straight application of the law would mean that you would have to go through a second security screening if your plane stops in Frankfurt on the way to Moscow or wherever. Now we will be entitled to the one-stop security system with just one check on your baggage when you get on the plane. So lots is happening, both on the continent and in here, in this country, to ensure that no deal is not a problem. One reason it appears to be a problem is not just the media is dominated by Remain supporting organs, but it is dominated by journalists. And journalists have a déformation professionnelle, as the French say, that they know they can't sell a newspaper, as I think William Hare said. You can't sell a newspaper with a headline, "Small earthquake in Chile, no one hurt." You have to have, if it bleeds, it leads. It's got to be something scary and painful. So that even newspapers which are sympathetic to Brexit have to highlight the scare stories. That's what they have to do. But it's up to us to say, yep, that was something to worry about, but action's been taken, that's not going to materialise. My guess is that if we do leave with no working withdrawal agreement, it will be quite as big an issue for us as the Millennium Bug was. That's assuming we do take vigorous action between now and then, businesses comply. And I remember that only 2 months, I think it was, before the turn of the millennium, Tony Blair was saying this is such a frightening prospect. He would be ready to call out the army and mobilise a terror line to deal with the disruption he anticipated. So when people make sort of similar statements about there being a lot to fear, just remember Tony Blair, if you can bear to.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to our meeting tonight one of the staunchest defenders of our precious union and one of the strongest advocates of Brexit in the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Sammy Wilson, Member of Parliament Sammy is one of Northern Ireland's best-known politicians. We've had both Arlene Foster and Nigel Dodds to address our meetings, but I do not believe that anyone has more sincerity or conviction in our cause than Sammy Wilson. Sammy began life in politics in 1981 as press officer of the DUP, which was led by the Reverend Ian Paisley. Now, I well remember an occasion when I was sitting in the chamber of the House of Commons when I became aware of a large figure leaning over the bench behind me and asking in a strong Ulster accent, "What's this all about?" I gave Dr. Paisley a brief summary of what, in his words, the debate was all about. A few minutes later, the speaker called the Reverend Ian Paisley. I thought he must be rising on a point of order, but in fact, he was able to turn my brief synopsis into a full-scale Paisley oration. Sammy Wilson has a wealth of political experience. He's been a Belfast City Councillor and has twice served as Lord Mayor of Belfast. In 1998, he was elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly. In 2008, he succeeded Eileen Foster as the Minister for the Environment in the Assembly Executive. Sammy is a global warming sceptic, having declared that reasoned debate must replace the scaremongering of the green climate alarmists. In 2009, Sammy succeeded Nigel Dodds to become Minister for Finance and Personnel in the Assembly Executive. In the 2005 general election, Sammy gained the East Antrim constituency with a majority of 7,304 votes, which he has now increased to 15,920. Sammy campaigned vigorously for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. He believes that our country would be better served being in charge of its own finances, trade and immigration.
Yes.
He is his party's Brexit spokesman and serves on the Brexit Select Committee. On the 1st of February 2017, with great foresight, Sammy asked the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland the following question. Will the Secretary of State reassure us that there will be no special status, no separate arrangements or different conditions, which would mean that Northern Ireland's position as a part of the United Kingdom would be changed? Great foresight by Sammy. I think he's a man who can smell a rat. The answer he received was not satisfactory. And that question posed by Sammy nearly 2 years ago goes to the very heart of the flawed agreement with which we are confronted today. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please give a warm welcome to the Right Honourable Sammy Wilson, Member of Parliament for Antrim.
Folks, this is not my notes. Otherwise you could be here to the end of the transition agreement period after about 15 years time, the way this agreement is going. But Kai, first of all, thank the Bruce Group for the invitation to come here and speak tonight, because of course Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland MPs have become a focus in all of these Brexit decisions and in all the Brexit debate. At one stage it was thought that all of this would hang upon the votes of 10 DUP MPs. To be quite truthful, we could stay at home next Tuesday. We could spectate from the gallery, because such is the anger against this agreement that it is not just Northern Ireland MPs who are going to be voting against it. From the Remainers, to the Leavers, to the Corbynites, to the Scottish Nationalists, Sinn Féin with kilts on, and the Liberal Democrats. I know they've all got different reasons for it. But at the heart of this, and really all of the flaws, or many of the flaws in this agreement, stem back to one crucial decision that the Prime Minister took. And she took it last December. She took it against very serious warnings from ourselves when she fell for the con trick that somehow or other the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic was so unique that you could not possibly have the United Kingdom leaving the EU unless they kept some link to the customs union, the single market, EU regulations, and if the UK didn't keep those, then Northern Ireland had to be separated off from the rest of the United Kingdom, and they had to fall under that regime. And that basically is where all of the problems about this agreement have rested. Now, I could give you many reasons. I mean, 'cause this agreement is amazing. If you go through it, the government, and this is how it starts. This is a legally binding, and this is the important thing about this agreement, folks. It is legally binding. It requires the government to do certain things. And there are 587 pages of things that they've got to do. And it starts off that they shall take all appropriate measures, whether general or particular, to ensure the fulfilment of the obligations in this agreement. And, you know, and it's right down to, and I'm not joking you when I say this, we've got to keep on pumping out EU propaganda. We are not allowed to say bad things about the EU in international trade and international organisations. We've got to abide by the rules, and of course, if we extend the period that we're in the EU, then whatever budgetary contributions we make after that will be simply told, there's the bill. Pay it up. We have no say in the size of the budget, and we have no say in the size of the budget which is handed us. But I want to deal just particularly with the backstop arrangement. Because of course, that has become the whole central point of this. And it's what has annoyed those who want to remain in the EU, and what has annoyed those of us who want to leave the EU. Because the argument runs like this, that where you've got a land border, now I don't see any distinction between a land border and a sea border. The same things have to be done when trade's crossing, whether it goes through ports or goes down a road. But where you've got a land border, then there are particular difficulties that have to be dealt with. You cannot have a land border with the EU without having checks on it, and they argue that the Belfast Agreement says you cannot have a hard border. Now, the Belfast Agreement doesn't actually even mention a hard border. It doesn't mention a border at all. It doesn't mention the EU, apart from the fact that the EU was going to give us a pile of money. And that money mostly went to paramilitaries, which was even worse. But but this was sold that somehow or other you would be contradicting the Belfast Agreement if you had a hard border. And of course that begs a second question. What do you mean by a hard border? I have asked this question many times. Now, does it mean you put a couple of barber poles across the main roads between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and lorries have to stop at them, and you look inside the lorries to see what's in them? Or does it mean that every road has to be blocked? All 360 of them? We tried that during the Troubles. We had 50,000 troops. We had watchtowers. We blew up roads. We put concrete bollards on them. We had patrols along the border. Oh, we did everything but mine it. And they still brought cattle across it, and cigarettes, and drink, and guns, and bombs, and terrorists. So what do we want? And Leo Varadkar, of course, in one of his more rhetorical moments, he said, I'm not going to have a Berlin Wall round the border. Nobody said, yes, you have a Berlin Wall round the border. And who was going to build it? But you know, what do you mean by a hard border? Now, this is where the nonsense we've got to, folks. Because when some of those who wish to remain in the EU came along to the Brexit Committee a number of weeks ago, and it was pointed out to them that, look, there are many ways in which the trade can be monitored across the border as it is at present. I'm going to talk to them about that in a moment or two. And I suggested to them that it may require some more administrative arrangements, where they would have some forms to fill in, some additional forms. That was regarded by some people as a hard border. Not that you filled the forms in at the border, but you sat in your office and filled these forms in. That's how ridiculous this argument has become. From having gunmen on the border to patrol it and stop the lorries getting across, to signing a bit of paper. None of it's acceptable. And I come to the conclusion when I hear that that the hard border argument is not about any friction in trade. It's not about facilitating the movement of trade across the border. It's all about finding ways of keeping us in an arrangement that the EU doesn't want us out of. And they have devised a means of doing it. Either, and this is what the backstop now says, either the whole of the United Kingdom stays in an arrangement whereby you're bound to the customs union, you're part of the customs territory, and you can't make your own trade deals, or else Northern Ireland is separated out. Either way, the United Kingdom is punished. The voters of the United Kingdom as a whole are punished by not being able to have the views which they expressed at the referendum exercised, or else the United Kingdom is punished by forcing its breakup. Now, as a Unionist, and as someone who, and I don't like playing in this, but you know, all of my years in politics, since I first entered politics, the Union has been under threat from terrorism. And you know, many of my colleagues were actually shot, some of them injured, some of them killed. Threats were made against me. The police warned me on many occasions. My house had reinforced glass, and I had to look under my car in the mornings to see if there wasn't a bomb and everything else. And I don't complain. I mean, that was part of the... But we did that, and we went through that. Because being part of the United Kingdom, with all of the historical connections, with all of that meant what that meant, being part of the 5th largest economy in the world, and having the freedoms which that entailed, were worth paying the price of standing up to terrorists for. And the one thing which irks us is that some bullying bureaucrats who want to punish the United Kingdom think that they can break up the United Kingdom. And for a part of the United Kingdom which has stood up to terrorism will have to fall under the whip of what Brussels want in order to make the United Kingdom pay the price for daring to want to leave. And we will resist this, and we will work with whoever we have to work with to resist it. Because if Northern Ireland goes, I can tell you, the Scottish nationalists are sitting, waiting, looking to see what are the lessons for Scotland and how can they capitalise on it. But the backstop arrangements, in my view, are not necessary. First of all, as I say, a hard border is not practical. But not only is it not practical, it is not necessary. What do you have to do at a border? Now, this is assuming, of course, and this is why the whole thing was back to front. Before we even knew what the future trade arrangement was, we were assuming that we had to collect taxes. We had to check goods. If a future trade arrangement was, as the government promised they were looking for, was tariff-free and quota-free, then of course there was no need to collect taxes. But there are 3 things that you need to do at a border. The first one is this: you've got to, if there are tariffs to be collected, if there are different rates and a common external tariff or what, you've got to collect taxes. That's already done across the Northern Ireland border. We have different rates of VAT. We have different excise duty. We have different corporation tax. We have different currencies. Now, we don't get lorries and vans stopped at present. There are according to the Irish government, there are 1,600 vehicle movements across the border every day, which entail carrying goods across the border. Not all of them would have any tax imposed on them. But that tax is collected. Diageo, who make Guinness in Dublin and bottle it in Belfast. They make Baileys in Belfast and sell it through the Irish Republic. They have 29,000 vehicle movements a year. Many of those, in fact, most of those, will entail movements which require payments to be made. And how do they do it? They simply give notification that we're taking these goods across the border, there's a duty, and every 3 months that duty is collected. I remember saying to the guy in Diageo, well, are you not tempted? I remember saying this to the guy in the HMRC, the Permanent Secretary in the HMRC, when he came to talk to us, is there not a temptation to say, well, we'll not declare it, and we'll avoid the tax? And he made me, the Permanent Secretary of the HMRC said, look, do you think that every tax demand is checked? We get millions of tax demands. You're going away now, I'm done. We get millions of tax demands every year, and millions of tax payments. We depend upon people declaring honestly what they owe, but of course they know the penalty, that if they're checked up and they are found to be defrauding, then we can go back years. There are penalties we paid. And Diageo said, that's the answer Diageo gave to me. He said, why would we risk that? We want movement across the border. We want to have the easiest way of paying our due and our tax and everything else. We would not risk the trusted trader status we have in order to do that. So taxes can be collected. Now, taxes can be collected at present. While we're okay, we're still part of the EU, but the principle of collecting taxes without stopping vehicles, without having a hard border, is already established. Why can that not apply if we are outside the EU and there's a common external tariff and goods come into Northern Ireland and we take them to the Republic and there's a tariff we pay? Well, you simply do the same as you do at present with VAT and with different excise duties. The second reason why they say you need to have checks at the border is because different goods may not comply with the regulations. They might not comply with health and safety regulations, they might not comply with agricultural regulations or whatever. Now, the EU trades currently with countries all over the world. Africa, South America, China, America. None of those areas of the world are in total conformity with EU regulations. Containers come in every day, hundreds of them, hundreds of thousands of them every year, millions of them probably every year. Do you think every container that comes in to the United Kingdom or Rotterdam or indeed Dublin port is checked? No, they're not. In fact, Peter said 1%. So how do you then ensure conformity? You don't ensure conformity at the border. You ensure conformity when the goods go out to distribution to shops. That's why you have trading standards officers. That's why you have people who go around checking. And if you're found to be in breach, if you're selling goods which don't conform, then you'll run the risk of losing your stock, paying penalties, and of course the firm which was sending those through will be subject to more spot checks in future. So you don't need to stop vehicles crossing the Irish border. And here's the irony. When the EU were suggesting, well, if we treat Northern Ireland differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, you really wouldn't notice the border checks. Because you know what we'll do? We'll do them away from the border. We'll do them at the point where they leave the factory. Or we'll do them when they reach the distributor in Northern Ireland. Now, if you can do that across the Irish Sea, you can do it across the Armagh-Monaghan border or the Londonderry-Donegal border. There's no reason why you can't. And yet here we have hundreds of pages telling us that it's not possible to do it. It can be done by keeping us in the customs union or in the single market. And you know, and I think when you look at it, another reason, of course, is for animal checks. And I accept, and I mean, the island of Ireland, especially with the high dependence on agriculture, we do, and we are very, very aware of biosecurity. And in fact, this is the excuse the government has made for having different regulations, EU regulations applying to Northern Ireland and not applying to the rest of the United Kingdom. They say, well, there's different regulations already. They're not different regulations. There are checks already. Yes, there are checks. But those are checks to make sure that the rules on animal health which apply in GB are adhered to, and because the animals come through one focal point, you can check, have they got TB, have they got any other disease, so that the virus, but it's only to ensure conformity of regulations which exist in both parts of the United Kingdom. The other argument is made is, I assure you people in Northern Ireland with devolution, you have different social legislation, you have different legislation on abortion, you have different legislation on gay marriage, and different legislation on a whole lot of other things. Yes, we do, but that's devolution. That's a choice that is made. What we have in this agreement is not a choice that the government of Northern Ireland would make. What we have in this agreement is that rules and regulations made in Brussels would automatically apply, whether they were good, bad or indifferent for Northern Ireland. Now, apart from the constitutional arrangements, and I don't want to go into that too deeply tonight, there are significant economic disadvantages, because this whole agreement is predicated on making sure that there's an open border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Our trade with the Irish Republic, or indeed with the EU as a whole, is about 14% of our total exports. The rest of our trade is with GB and with the rest of the world. And yet, if this agreement goes through, and the legal note which the Attorney General has issued indicates today that if one of the problems with these regulations, the backstop recognises that such an arrangement has potential to lead to, one, a form of friction in trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, our biggest market. 5 times more trade goes to GB than goes to Europe, and also to cause trade distortion. So economically this is not good for Northern Ireland. And of course the other thing is that if, and I can understand why a future government may well say, we're sick and tired of the UK-wide backstop restricting us in what we can do and the freedom we can have in changing our regulations to suit more the circumstances of today, and being tied that we cannot have a customs arrangement, and may well decide we now want out of that. And if that happens, then of course the barriers between Northern Ireland go up further and further, and the agreement makes it quite clear that Northern Ireland, which is more export orientated than any other part of the UK economy because we've got such a small local market. You may not know it, we produce 1/3 of all of the seats that are made for aircraft. So if you sit in rows C or F, you're probably sitting in a seat that was made in Northern Ireland. We produce 40% of the stone crushing equipment that's produced for the whole world. That's exported all around the place. And I could go through lots of other examples because we're an export-oriented economy. But yet we would find ourselves unable to participate in trade deals that the UK would make with the growing parts of the world because we will be tied to the EU customs union. Folks, I don't want to prolong it any longer. I could say I want more, but I don't want to prolong it any more. We will be voting against this agreement next Tuesday. If the Prime Minister brings it the following week, we'll be voting against it the following week. And she can bring it forward on Christmas Day, and we'll be here on Christmas Day to vote against it as well. Because it's not just a bad deal for Northern Ireland. This is a bad deal for the United Kingdom. And it does not honour the referendum. It does not honour the pledges which were made in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2017. It does not honour the promises which the Prime Minister made in our Lancaster House speech, or our Florence speech, or our White Paper. And if we're going to have any trust in the people who we send out to negotiate for us, then they've got to deliver on the promises that they made. And if they can't deliver on that, then let somebody else do the job.
Thank you so much for that, Sammy. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Daniel Kawczynski, the Member of Parliament for Shrewsbury and Atcham. He's the first British Member of Parliament born in Poland. In the 2005 general election, he gained the seat of Shrewsbury and Atcham from Labour on a 5.4% swing. Daniel has served on the Justice Select Committee and the International Development Select Committee, and he has worked tirelessly to improve Anglo-Polish relations. Daniel is also a keen supporter of fox hunting. Oh. I thought that might go down well. I also understand that he's the tallest ever member of the House of Commons. Now, the previous holder of this distinction was Sir Louis Gluckstein, Member of Parliament for Nottingham East from 1931 to 1945. Now, I knew Sir Louis well in his latter years, and I heard him make dozens of speeches as president of the St. Malvern Conservative Association. But not once did he ever mention that in the Norway debate, in the House of Commons, in May 1940, probably the most important division in the House of Commons, that he followed the three-line whip and supported Neville Chamberlain. 80 Conservative MPs on that occasion abstained or voted against their government. This led to Chamberlain resigning as Prime Minister and being replaced by Churchill. Without those 80 rebels, the very existence of our country would have been at stake. In a week's time, we will have, in my opinion, the most important vote in the House of Commons since the Norway debate of 1940. Daniel has pledged in this vote he will defy the three-line whip and vote against the plan. Yes, he will vote against the plan agreed by Theresa May and the European Commission, a plan designed to make us a mere vassal state. Daniel, your decision is right and proper, and you have the support of everyone in this room.
Yes, I better adjust the mic because I am actually the tallest ever Member of Parliament at 6'9", and of course anything over 6'8.5" is officially a giant. But yes, I am the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, and we came to this country in 1978 because my parents fled the tyranny of communism and all the consequences that communism had on Poland. And so I have lived in a country which has zero sovereignty, a vassal state, a complete vassal state, a satellite nation, a nation that was not controlled internally, but by controlled another country overseas. And when I was standing to be the parliamentary candidate for Shrewsbury, somebody said to me, my name is Kawczynski, but somebody at the end of the audience said, well, Kawasaki. Kawczynski, that's not a very Shropshire name, is it? How are you going to get on with a name like Kawczynski? And I said, well, it didn't cause my grandfather's generation of Poles who were fighting in the Battle of Britain any problems. So I hope it doesn't cause me any problems this evening. And they all cheered at that. But you know, there are two films at the moment, and in exchange for me coming to address you here, I would like to ask you to go and have a look at one of them. One of them is called the Hurricane movie, the other one is called the 303 Squadron, and it outlines the unique contribution of Polish fighter pilots to the Battle of Britain. Britain was a beacon of hope in 1940, not just for Polish pilots, but for pilots from all over occupied Europe. And the 303 Squadron, the Poles who came here, they shot down more enemy aircraft than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. They were, in many ways, kamikaze. Their country had been taken over, their women folk brutalized by the Germans, Warsaw 95% destroyed. They had nothing to lose. And they came here to the United Kingdom to carry on that struggle for freedom. And many of them, along with their British counterparts, gave up their lives in order so that we can have freedom today. And the most important thing in my parliamentary career was an evening at the RAF Club with Lord Tevitt, who served along Peter Lilley, and he said something very important. There was an Anglo-Polish dinner at the RAF Club. Half the table were Poles, the other half English. And he said, well, you know, you can replace the planes relatively easily, but you can't replace the pilots. It takes a long time to train up the pilots. And he said that the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe was so evenly matched in the summer of 1940 that it was the Poles coming here that tipped the balance to win the Battle of Britain. Baroness Trumpington, many of you will know, who died recently, worked at Bletchley. And also the Poles were at Bletchley. Many Polish mathematicians came to Bletchley and were instrumental in breaking the Enigma codes, which also, we believe, shortened the war significantly. So I say those things about Poland, really, because I want you to understand where I am coming from as a Polish-born British Member of Parliament, a man who loves both countries, a man who is loyal to Britain, but also to Poland. But when I was standing to be an officer in the Navy, they said to me, well, Kawczynski, the Polish ship is sailing towards us, firing on us, what do you do? And this was the summer of 1990. And I said, well, that's not fair, because communism has just fallen. And he said, he used a rather rude word, cut them, Kawczynski. Poland's still in the Warsaw Pact, because you remember there was an interregnum after the fall of communism, there was still the Warsaw Pact. And I said, well, sir, I would issue the order to fire. And I think that is very, very important for those of us who have come to this country from overseas to show the passion and the loyalty and the dedication that we have for this country that has given so much to us. Now again, under very different circumstances, we are a beacon of hope to hundreds of millions of our fellow European citizens across the whole of the continent of Europe. These Eurosceptics who also, like us, have serious reservations about the direction of travel of this organisation and about the loss of sovereignty for their countries. What will happen to them if the United Kingdom caves in or surrenders? The fifth largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a country that has given, according to the House of Commons Library, over £300 billion of your money in net contributions since we joined. What hope is there for these other countries if the United Kingdom caves in and continues, as Sammy has said, to be part of this structure and leaving in name only. We are going to show that they can stand up to the loss of sovereignty, stand up to the bullying that they have experienced, and stand up to the threats that they constantly get from the unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels. And I go back now, I'm a fluent Polish speaker. It's one of the most difficult languages in the world, but Jak się masz, there you are, well done, extra points. That's how are you in Polish. But I go back to Warsaw more and more, and I'm already meeting with the Eurosceptic caucus in the Polish Parliament. Think about this, a massive net contributor of EU funds, and yet already they have their own cross-party Eurosceptic caucus in the Polish Parliament. And do you know what they say to me? They say to me this: if we had 1.2 billion people in the world who spoke Polish, if we had 58 countries across the world in a Commonwealth that were aligned to us, if 20% of the world spoke Polish, we too would be leaving the European Union. But they are, ladies and gentlemen, already experience an extraordinary amount of interference in their domestic affairs. I haven't got the time to explain to you all of the extraordinary issues, all of the threats that the Polish government is coming under over various issues. But the Polish government has been democratically elected by the Polish people, and they are directly accountable to the Polish people, not the bureaucrats in Brussels. And this is what they don't understand. Poland is very sensitive to this outside interference because they have had no sovereignty for so many generations. Now, the idea that they're going to be dictated to by Brussels is something of great concern to them. I wanted to speak very briefly about the worries for the rest of the European Union moving towards a supranational state and how we must be the beacon for them, and why the decision next week will be pivotal in us being able to be that beacon for them. But before I say that, I'd like to pay tribute to all of you in this room, because it was you in 1999 who forced the politicians to keep our pound sterling. Do you remember that debate nearly 20 years ago? It wasn't Gordon Brown who saved the pound sterling. It was, if you go back 20 years, so many people were coming up to me. I wasn't even the Member of Parliament at that time. But in my constituency, so many people said, carry on with your European Union project. Carry on sending £200 million of our money every week to the European Union. But you're not going to give up our currency. That is a step too far. That is a loss of sovereignty for the United Kingdom, which is moving too far. And we are not going to allow you to ditch our currency. So I pay tribute to you and the Bruges Group and every other organisation that helped that to materialise, because if it hadn't, I'm absolutely convinced that in the referendum that we had 2 years ago, that referendum may have been lost. With Operation Fear or Operation Terror, can you imagine how close the referendum was? There would have been people in our society who would have been petrified at the prospect of pulling out of the European Union and changing our currency at the same time. It would have been too complicated, too problematic. So the fact that we've kept our currency, one of only two countries with a permanent opt-out from the Eurozone, is absolutely instrumental today in our ability to reject this deal and become a sovereign nation state again. There are 19 Eurozone countries, but there are another 8 countries that have no rights not to join the Eurozone. When they joined the European Union, they signed a document which stated that at some stage in the future they will have to abandon their currencies. But I have to say to you, in the Czech Republic, 71% of the electorate don't want to give up their currency. In Sweden, it's 72%. And in the country of my birth, Poland, 62% of the electorate do not want to abandon their currencies. And do you remember what Helmut Kohl said when he was interviewed, the late German Chancellor? I knew I would lose a plebiscite on getting rid of the Deutschmark. I knew the German people would not tolerate losing the Deutschmark, so we just introduced it anyway. And that has always been the case, that the people don't know what they're doing, and we have to make decisions on their behalf for their betterment. And now, also, they're talking about a single European army. I have to tell you that I take my daughter, Alexis, every year to the Polish-Russian border, to the seaside there, and I say to her, darling, this is the most highly militarized part of Europe, the Polish-Russian border, where NATO meets Russia. If the tit-for-tat military deployments, the missile deployments, continue at the pace that they have done over the last 10 years, this is going to be the European equivalent of the North and South Korean border. The tensions and the difficulties that are now starting to surface with Russia, one cannot begin to underestimate. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, what is it that has kept the peace on the continent of Europe for the last 70 years? NATO, an organization that hasn't lost a square inch of territory since its inception 70 years ago. In the referendum that we had, some constituents came up to me in Shrewsbury and said, well, Mr. Kawczynski, we're going to vote to remain because the European Union has kept the peace. Has kept the peace on the continent of Europe. I had to sit them down momentarily and explain to them why it was NATO. And the EU army, ladies and gentlemen, and the reason I tell you this is because the situation is so serious. The EU army, at best, will duplicate NATO, and at worst, it will usurp the supremacy of NATO on our continent. We've heard already the French president saying that they need to protect themselves against America, a country that has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men in 2 world wars to liberate that country. And think about the 6, when we pull out of the European Union, think about the 6 countries that are members of NATO that are not members of the European Union and never will be. America and Britain, 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Canada and Iceland, helping to keep the Atlantic open in the event of a war between America and Russia. Norway in the extreme north, Arctic. Turkey protecting our southern flank from ISIS. No, ladies and gentlemen, we must work with like-minded countries like Poland and others to ensure that we maintain NATO as the supreme defense posture. And then people say to me when I go to Brussels, what's it got to do with you? You're pulling out of the European Union. It's none of your business. My answer to them is, there isn't a single village in Shropshire that didn't lose men during the First World War. 731,000 British men lost their lives in the First World War, 432,000 in the Second World War. I take great exception to comments like that, and everybody in Europe must realize that the United Kingdom will always protect Europe, no matter what, because we know that we will never have our liberty unless the whole of Europe is for free. I wouldn't be so worried about them taking over the defense of the continent of Europe if they weren't so efficient in all the other things they were doing. The EU, in my view, I quote this to my constituents, has the opposite of the Midas touch. Anything it touches turns to dust. Look at the catastrophic mismanagement of the situation in Greece. Look at the appalling mismanagement of the refugee crisis from Syria. Look at their inability to deal with the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, with hundreds of thousands of people coming across and many lives being lost with the smugglers. And look at the Eurozone crisis. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, these people being responsible for the defense of our continent? I shudder at the thought. Now, I'm going to wrap up, but I want to say to you 2 things why I'm going to vote against this deal. One of them is the Northern Ireland backstop. I've just come from a 2-hour meeting with the Attorney General, who was speaking to us on the floor of the House, and he could not give me sufficient guarantees about our friends in Northern Ireland, that somehow, if we don't secure an agreement with the Europeans, that they will not be used as some sort of sacrifice or some sort of pawn to be somehow trapped away from the United Kingdom. And we questioned him sufficiently. He said that it's a risk, and it's something that we have to consider. It's a risk I'm not prepared to take. We owe the DUP an extraordinary honour, blood honour. I was reading the other day, Sammy spoke about some of the things that he's been through. I was reading the other day an article about how Arlene Foster's father was shot and had to crawl back onto their farm, all blooded. And Arlene, Mrs. Foster, saw her father riddled with bullets on the farm. What these people have been through, to maintain and safeguard their British identity is absolutely remarkable. I've never seen, I don't have anything like the experience of Peter Lilley, but I've only been a Member of Parliament for 13 years, but I've never seen, in those 13 years, the amount of raw emotion, genuine concern, and absolute determination from any other members of Parliament than is emanating at the moment from the DUP, with all of their convictions, all of their determination, that their part of the United Kingdom will not somehow be wrought away from the rest of the country. The Attorney General, I looked at him when the Attorney General looked at the DUP benches, and he said to them this evening, you have to vote for the interests of the whole of the United Kingdom. Well, I have a message to you, Geoffrey. The United Kingdom doesn't exist without Northern Ireland. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, as a Member of Parliament, you see extraordinary difficulties in the constituency that you represent. People think of Shrewsbury as some quiet, and we had the honour of Peter Lilley coming to Shrewsbury the other week and addressing us. People think of Shrewsbury as a quiet little sleepy Shropshire town, famous for its flower show and river loop and all the rest of it. I have to say to you, I can take you to schools in my constituency with leaking roofs, poor insulation, where they're making cutbacks to teaching assistants. I can take you to the local Royal Shrewsbury Hospital, where there are people still on trolleys at peak winter times because there are not enough beds for them. And yet we are handing over £200 million of your money every week to an organisation that hasn't had its account signed off for 24 years in a row. When I spent an hour with the Attorney General on the telephone asking him about the £39 billion, when he was talking to me, he said to me last week, I said to him, how much of this £39 billion do we really owe? That was my question. That was the question I wanted him to answer as the Attorney General. He said to me over the telephone, I reckon that legally speaking, we probably owe them £8 billion. 8 billion. But today, on the floor of the House of Commons, when he answered from my friend Philip Davies, the MP for Shipley, the very same question, he said it's very difficult to calculate. I suggest you look in Hansard, and then I continued to probe him, and I said, well, how can you ask us, when we have so many shortages in our own constituencies, how can you ask us to vote for £39 billion of your money to be transferred when you cannot give me a genuine legal opinion as to what it is that we genuinely owe them? And what I suspect although I can't prove it. But what I suspect, the 39 billion, or I should say the 31 billion, and by the way, the 8 billion is challengeable anyway, according to Geoffrey Cox. What I suspect is, do you know what I suspect this is? This is a bribe for a possibility of a maybe. For a possibility of a maybe trade agreement. So the European Union has been working with Mercosur, the organization in Latin America, for the last 8 years on the trade agreement. And today we have Monsieur Macron telling us that he may veto that trade agreement because the new Brazilian president wants to pull out of the Paris climate change agreement. Can you imagine those circumstances where we have handed over £39 billion of your money, and then 2 years on after the transition period, we still haven't got a trade deal with these people? These people are coming under more and more pressure. What do you think the British electorate would think of the Conservative Party then? It would destroy the Conservative Party. So, for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I have informed my whip this evening that I will be voting against the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Now it's an opportunity for you to put your questions to the panel. Yes, I have a question from the gentleman there. Yes, try and make your questions as brief as possible.
I will indeed. I know about hard border. I came from a public school, we had a hard border. Did boxing.
Hard boarding.
Yes.
Microphone.
Thank you very much for the mic. Does the ECJ have the legal power to overturn the result of the EU in or out referendum and the Article 50 and prevent, stop Britain from leaving the EU? And also, are they entitled to send the EU army to Britain to enforce such a decision?
Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, there is a case going on at present as to whether or not a country, us, has the right to withdraw its application under Article 50 to leave. Probably makes no difference what their opinion is, because I can't imagine that we could get a majority in the House of Commons to withdraw it, and certainly none of us here would be in favour of it. But the interesting thing is the EU Commission is arguing against giving the right of member states to withdraw, because they're worried that if they did, then lots of other countries might sort of start the process of leaving, knowing that they could pull back if things got a bit difficult, and they might start all sorts of kerfuffles. So they actually would prefer it to be what we all supposed it was originally, an irrevocable decision. But as far as I'm concerned, it is irrevocable anyway. And not only do we leave automatically under Article 50 on the 29th of March, but we passed an Act of Parliament which makes us leave automatically on the 29th of March. So it would require a repeal of that, as well as a decision to try and withdraw the original letter that Mrs. May sent in 2 years ago, or whenever it was.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'll take a question from yes, Chris Gill.
Christopher Gill. My question is to Sammy. Given that there is likely to be a vacancy at the head of the Conservative Party in the would you use your political muscle to ensure that the next leader of the Conservative Party is an uncompromising Brexiteer?
It's a question we have been asked on a large number of occasions. But I suppose I would just answer it like this. Although we are in an arrangement with the Conservative Party at present in the conference and supply arrangement, We are not part of the Conservative Party, and I do think it would be arrogant of us to say who the next leader of the Conservative Party should be, or indeed to try and exercise any leverage. However, what we have said is that if the conference and supply arrangement is to keep on going, it has to coincide with the promises which were made. And I really don't care who delivers that. And it is not any of my business, because I don't have a vote in the Conservative Party leadership election. But the one thing I do know is that if, and this government does need our support until the end of the period of this Parliament, we want to give it to them because we believe in the programme which they want to see through. But it will only be on the basis that they do not follow a policy which is going to break up the United Kingdom, and whoever delivers on that will have our support.
Now, Daniel, you're the only person in this room that will actually have a vote if there is a change in the leadership of the Conservative Party. What is your answer to the question we just had?
Well, I didn't vote for Mrs. May. My gut instincts when we were having the previous election was, who do we vote for to safeguard Brexit? Now, I can't explain why Boris Johnson and Michael Gove got into the fracas that they did, but inevitably that led to a Remainer being elected as the leader of the Conservative Party. What we have to do this time, when there is a vacancy and there's a contest, Brexiteers have to unite behind one candidate in order to ensure that an authentic, genuine Brexiteer takes over as Prime Minister, leader of the party and Prime Minister. There are many credible candidates. I'm not going to reveal who I favour just yet, but I'm happy to speak to you afterwards.
Yes, I'll take a question from the gentleman again.
Yes. This question is addressed to Peter Lilley. First of all, may I congratulate you? I turned on Sky News just after 12 o'clock, and I heard your, frankly, quite magnificent performance in answering questions put to you in relation to the WTO. And it's a pity that it's not really possible to spread the propaganda which we need to spread in a short period of time to make people realise that the WTO system and its trading rules is something that we can all actually apply and work perfectly well. My question is this. I don't understand why, given the difference between deal and no deal, and the fact that the Prime Minister said there's only one deal on the table, and if that is defeated, is it not the case that the no deal becomes the default position, ergo ruling out the possibility of the quite absurd second referendum, which defies logic? How the people can understand all the things at issue there, I do not know, or a general election. In other words, is there not an argument for saying there's only one situation, we've got a no deal, nothing else, and we will be perfectly happy to move towards the WTO system?
Yes, it is true that if Parliament votes down this agreement, then and nothing else happens, we leave on WTO terms, WTO plus, as I like to say. But of course, the government could go back and renegotiate, and maybe come up with something like a Canada-style free trade deal, which I'd be very happy with. My concern is that they might go back and renegotiate and get something purely cosmetic.
Yes.
When there have been renegotiations following referenda that have gone the wrong way, when people haven't done as they're told in Ireland or Denmark or whatever, typically the government is told to go back and discusses it with the EU, and the EU says, we've made some changes, they don't really tell you what they are, and the people are told to vote again. There could be a danger of Parliament being given something spurious, and told to vote again. I think Parliament might actually be quite difficult to pull the wool over its eyes, because we do go through these things in detail, and there'll be feeling that we're insulted if it comes back with something purely cosmetic, but we shall have to see. That is the danger. A sensible renegotiation that says, sorry, the whole Irish backstop thing is unnecessary and unacceptable. All we need is a pledge that none of the parties involved is going to erect our border or carry out checks on the border. As Sammy explained, we can do all these things by administrative processes, by electronic declarations, as we do on VAT and everything else. Once that's gone, we can have a sensible deal. The trouble is, of course, there are people in the government machine who have wanted to keep us in a customs union and single market. It wasn't that they were forced by the EU raising the Irish border, they seized upon it as an excuse for keeping us in.
The names of these people.
Establishments, Robbins,
Why?
Rogers.
Why?
Thank you for those expert comments. Can I take a question down from the lady on the front row? Yes, you know.
When, I won't say it, when this deal falls next Tuesday, what are the chances of the Prime Minister resigning? Or if she doesn't resign, what are the chances of a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't really want to speculate on that at the moment. What I would say is it depends on just how badly she loses. I think this evening I sensed a real sea change in the mood of the Conservative Parliamentary Party during the course of the 2-hour discussion that we had with the Attorney General. 2 hours he was answering our questions, and Tory MP after Tory MP stood up and was asking basically the question about Northern Ireland backstop. And as the session progressed, it was more painfully evident that the Attorney General could not give us the guarantees that we were seeking. And therefore, I think, if anything, the numbers are growing of dissenters, rather than diminishing, as some media reports would have you believe, because of this very, very serious issue. So if she loses by a very significant amount, then I think obviously it's going to be very, very difficult for her to try to renegotiate. So if you believe that we should get rid of this deal, continue to lobby your own members of Parliament about the importance of standing up to the whips. I won't start telling you some of the pressures that we get put under. I'll leave that for another day. But it's very, very important that you get your members of Parliament to stand firm on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I have a question? Yes, from this gentleman here in the dark glasses.
Thank you very much. Everybody here. I have an extreme sort of question for all of you, by the way, yet pertinent to the extreme existential, ludicrous predicament we find ourselves in as a nation. The question is, am I right in saying there are grounds, legitimate and sensible ones, for taking May, and certain other psychologically shallow, I was going to explain why I said all that, but I won't have time on that. Life and history, ignorant pro-Remainer politicians, are there grounds for taking these people to court for treason? Seriously, I am serious.
Thank you.
They're arguing, excuse me sir, they're arguing, they're struggling, they're conniving to remain subjugated under foreign, unelected bureaucrats and politicians, all of whom have little time and no love for our people and our way of life, is surely tantamount to inciting treason. I know this would have been the case in times gone by.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Well, I will start by saying, look, of course there are certain people's views in the House of Commons that are extraordinarily frustrating, and of course it's very, very difficult to understand how some MPs could have the views that they have. And there are some members of Parliament who are deliberately trying to use this impasse to overturn Brexit. There are some who want another referendum. One thing I've said to my own constituents is, over my dead, cold, listless body, will I be voting for another referendum? And what I find amazing is the risks that these people are prepared to take. They already see how divided our nation is. They see how families have been torn apart and communities. It's quite extraordinary. And the idea that they want to put us through the same process again, potentially make our country a laughingstock by overturning the previous decision, I'm just simply not prepared to countenance it. So to answer your question, sir, look, I wouldn't go as far as to say some people are acting in a treasonous way. Yes, we strongly oppose them. Yes, we strongly disagree with the direction of travel that they want to take. But the way we have to deal with them is defeating this bill on the floor of the House of Commons on the December the 11th. That is the most important priority.
In theory, in the scarlet pullover, yes, you sir.
What can be done about the BBC?
Peter, you've had quite a bit of experience.
I don't know whether any of you still listen to the Today programme, but I found myself on it the other day after a 2-year lapse. They don't consider it appropriate to interview someone who's been Secretary of State, Trade and Industry, involved in negotiating a trade round and the setting up the WTO and introducing a single market programme in this country, because that's obviously irrelevant to what's been going on. But I did get on and had a perfectly reasonable interview with John Humphreys. Then they put on someone called a reality correspondent to do a reality check on me. And fortunately, I was still in the studio, so I was able to do a reality check on him as he went through. But later in the day, of course, the BBC still had to get their answer backs on the PM programme. Evan Davis played back a bit of this exchange between me and the reality checker and said, we ought to get to the bottom of this. Now, it's quite clear that one thing Mr. Lilley and the reality checker would agree on is that what he said is disagreed with by a majority of experts in the country. Thoughtful people. And then they went on and had some professor of politics to discuss my views on trade and friction. I don't know anything about either, but I eventually got, I spent half a day finding out who to get in touch with and got the right of reply. Had another interview with Mr. Evan Davis, who repeated this absurd thing that what I'd said was that if we leave the customs union, then the friction of our border from having to fill in forms is much less than people imagine. And in the document, I'd actually quoted an organisation called CLICAT, which is the 19,000 companies across Europe who deal with customs and excise and that sort of thing. And they said that in their opinion, we could have a virtually frictionless border if we leave and a smooth exit. So I said to him, well, actually, the experts, these are the people, seem to agree with me. Don't you think we were wrong? No, he said, I don't. So we're dealing with an organisation which endeavoured to be as balanced as it was capable of being during the referendum. But since it lost it has been shaped. And it is important that you do write calmly, write very briefly, and write to the editor of whatever programme it is, and say, why didn't we hear the other view? At the end of my dispute with this reality correspondent, oh, by the way, when I came on with Evan Davis, I said I thought it's very odd that they should have someone called a reality correspondent. Did that mean that he, Evan Davis, was an unreality correspondent? This was probably not a good way to start off the interview, but get in touch with them and at the end of the programme I said, I thought it was good. that they criticised me. I thought it was good that they challenged what I had to say and put forward alternative views. I only wish they'd ever do that to the Remain case.
Would you like to put your question? Here comes the microphone.
Hi, this is a question for Peter Lilley. You served in the cabinet of Margaret Thatcher, and you served in the cabinet of Margaret Thatcher, and I would just like, from a historic point of view, to know how you would see her envisaging this scenario and what on earth she would be, her reaction.
She would never have got to this situation.
No, I realise that.
She didn't renegotiate the British contribution, got the rebate. And she did that even though she had almost no obvious negotiating cards, because Ted Heath had committed to signing to a treaty which required us to pay over this money by going and hammering away. And then when they were resisting and resisting, letting it be known that the British government was drafting legislation which would have withheld our contribution. Now that would have been a huge step had we done that, because such legislation would have been in conflict with the European treaties. But when they realised that she was prepared to go that far, they gave in. So you do need to be tough. I don't take the view that the Europeans and Mr. Barnier are nasty. They've been simply pursuing the interests of the European Union in a way which is perfectly sensible. But they couldn't believe that the British government was being so weak and febrile and willing to concede everything. It makes, as I said on the Skype programme today, it makes Neville Chamberlain look like a really hard-nosed negotiator.
Yes, the gentleman in the glasses there with the sports coat on. I think he does. Yes, you, sir. Yes. The gentleman with the sports coat, just at the back, standing at the back there. Keep going. This gentleman.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of listening to the Attorney General today on the telly. Not quite sure it's so much of a pleasure, but still. Question. The Attorney General seems to have two roles. One is to advise the government as its chief law officer, and Parliament as well. Having what I heard, are there many people going to Erskine May to see if he is in contempt of Parliament?
Sammy.
Yeah, I think that it's quite clear there was a humble address. The humble address does require the government to respond in the terms of the humble address. He hasn't done that. The government has made it quite clear that they don't intend to do it, and I think that he will be found to be in contempt of Parliament. And I suppose the question, the question which many people will be asking is, and I know that I've been a minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and there were times I withheld some of the legal advice that I got even from the ministers in the executive, because maybe there was disputes between departments or whatever. And under the convention that you do not make available legal advice, but I think that, and his arguments today was, of course, this could jeopardise national security and everything else, but this was a very specific request. That first of all, this is an agreement which is going to affect the United Kingdom for generations. Secondly, it's a legally binding agreement. But thirdly, the EU nitpick over every legal detail. And therefore, it is important that we understand exactly what we're signing up to legally. And on those grounds, I think that it was right to demand that from the government. If they refuse, then we have made the request, the letter's gone to the Speaker, and I think that he will be found in contempt. And that would be hugely politically embarrassing for the government.
So this has gone in.
It has, yes, and it'll be one, hugely politically embarrassing for the government. But secondly, I think will raise many questions amongst the general population. What is it that you're trying to hide? are notes based on the kind of evidence he has given to the ministers. Now, there's one particular worrying bit in this, as far as there's lots of particularly worrying bits. But I mean, one of the things he has said is, oh no, once we negotiate a future trade arrangement, then of course the backstop need no longer apply. And he made a lot of play today on the fact that their best endeavours and good faith. But this is what the advice was given to the cabinet. That whilst there are legal obligations at international law level, they do not stretch as far as obliging the EU to enter into a future trade arrangement which it does not consider to be in its interests. So that's a justification for not, you can say we have done our best, we have engaged in fair engagement, but we do not believe it's in our interests. Now, given what's in this withdrawal agreement, what would be in the EU's interests? They've got everything they want. They've got the money, they've got us tied to the customs union, they've got us tied to the single market. Well, can't even say bad things about them. So that you can be sure that they'll say, it's not in our interest, you're not getting out.
Sammy, do you think this issue with the Attorney General will be settled before we have the vote next week?
No, I don't think it will. I mean, I think it's one of the things with Parliament procedure, it's likely to drag on a bit. But I mean, we intend to push it because I think that it's a good backdrop to the discussion, to the debate anyway. But I think it does raise the kind of questions that I've raised here tonight. What is it that the government is? I mean, you can't fall behind the argument that this opens the floodgates. It doesn't open the floodgates. And you know, I can say there have been other occasions when we have actually argued against the opposition parties for the revelation of material which we believe would have prejudiced negotiations. And we will continue to adopt that. But this is a specific request, and I think it's justified given the seriousness of the issue.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a request as well as a question. The request is, next time any of you are interviewed and someone suggests that leaving without it on the World Trade Organization deal is going off a cliff, could you ask them why?
Yes.
Could you ask them to explain that? Because they get away with it every time. But this is a more controversial question. Do you think the Prime Minister has lied in the House?
Yes.
And if so, why is no one making a deal about this?
They're waiting a few more days.
Sammy, you've heard a lot of politicians and Prime Ministers in the House of Commons.
I do think that she has been untruthful. She's been untruthful in terms of what she has argued about the impact in Northern Ireland of the backstop. I mean, she has said that first of all, it is only very few regulations that we would be tied to in the if we had to exercise the backstop. There are 219 regulations in this withdrawal agreement, over 68 pages, and the legal opinion which was given in the legal note today indicated that just in case the EU had missed anything, that in future any that were covered by this agreement, any new regulations were covered by this agreement, would have to apply to Northern Ireland. Now, she has tried to make it out that this will have very little impact. You already have different regulations, and it will be simply around the areas of animal health. It is not state aid, environmental laws, labour laws, etc. She has also said that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and GB. And again, already the EU, and the agreement makes it quite clear. I'll turn to the pages on it if you want to be bored. But the agreement makes it quite clear that that first of all, the terms of the agreement will mean that there will have to be a border between Northern Ireland and GB.
And all that the government is committed to doing, there's one paragraph or one article on this, is to act in best faith to try and avoid that as only where it is possible. In other words, where it does not contradict and does not conflict with EU customs rules. And again, she has told us this, but the biggest truth that we have had in the House was, time and time again, she stood up and said, I will protect Northern Ireland. We actually wrote and she accepted a paragraph in the agreement which would have circumvented all of this backstop stuff. And that was dropped, even though up until March of last year she said that no Prime Minister could ever sign up to an agreement which did not include something like that. And so I mean, she has told, she's been untruthful, and I think it's one of the reasons why many of her own backbenchers are unhappy, because they've been untruthful to them as well.
I think what I'd like to say about the, rather than commenting about the Prime Minister, your first question, which is the WTO and the cliff edge. I've spent a lot of time in my constituency over the weekend engaging with companies that export to the European Union and talking to their managing directors. And in one case, one of the companies exports 20% of their products to America and 20% of their products to the European Union. And the managing director said to me, look, we export quite happily to the Americans. We fill out the customs forms, we pay the duty, we will adapt and change to those circumstances. Let's just get on with it. And what is really demoralizing is that there doesn't seem to be the same level of confidence in British people being able to make these changes from the politicians in Westminster. Somehow this cliff edge, somehow the economy will go into recession, there'll be chaos. And we had all of that in the last referendum. They said that unemployment will go up by 500,000, and that there would be a run on the pound, that the inflation will go through the roof, that interest rates would go up, that your homes would, that the price of your homes would collapse. None of that happened. And now we have the Governor of the Bank of England, who I would argue has so highly politicised his role. I went back to the 75 referendum, and I was reading over the weekend some of the comments from the Governor of the Bank of England in the 75 referendum. Nothing like what Mr. Carney has been doing. And I think he's done significant damage to the Bank of England in politicising his role. So let's have confidence in our British manufacturers to make these changes, because they have confidence that they can make these changes very, very quickly.
Just staying on this question for the moment, Peter, you were in Parliament for quite a long time. You were there when Liam Britton had to resign over Westland. Have you any views on the integrity of government and politicians in the conduct of these matters?
I, for 34 years in the House of Commons, always took the view that I should not accuse my opponents of lying when I thought that what they said wasn't correct. That I assumed that we might disagree, they just saw things differently, hadn't realised it wasn't correct, and that's why they said something that wasn't true. That a liar is someone who says something that's true knowingly, saying it's true, and not confronting it with their conscience. But the Prime Minister is certainly saying things which are not true. I find it hard to believe. I mean, she's a nice lady, with antecedents and so on. How she can say these things without it clashing with everything she knows, I just don't know. I mean, there seems to be something in the air in number 10 Downing Street. The only other person like her is Blair. I got elected the same day as Blair, and I got on quite well with him. But he suddenly, sort of halfway through his, learned to say things which were just not true, with a perfectly straight face and apparently believing them about weapons of mass destruction and all that sort of thing. And so it's terribly sad, but we shouldn't worry about calling her a liar. We should just point out that what she's saying is not true. It is not true that there's not going to be a border between Northern Ireland and the UK. Quite the contrary, people will actually have to fill in customs declarations in the old style. I mean, it lays down in the treaty
this agreement, they're going to have to fill in paper things that have a sort of wet stamp to check them. It hasn't been done like that since I was in charge of Customs and Excise. It's done electronically everywhere else, but they cut and pasted it from an agreement with Turkey. We're still done with paper. I mean, wet stamps would slow down trade enormously. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Gentleman right at the back there. I think you've got a white shirt on, sir. That's it.
Hello, Tom Dixon. So, we've heard about Norway, 1940, and some of us watched that movie, that film with the whole thing about Churchill replacing Neville Chamberlain. My question is for Sammy. So, first of all, let's put a little bit of bracket. This will take 2 minutes maximum for me, but just to give some info before we hear your response, sir, because I think it's the most important response we're going to hear all night. It's the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, passed by Cameron. It creates this strange window. It's a 14-day window, Sammy, during which you and your party are the kingmakers, and here's why. And this is why I need an answer from you today. We all need this answer from you today. Because during that 14-day window, assuming on the 12th, the day after, she loses this vote by a huge majority, let's say she loses by 80 votes, but she refuses to resign because she's pig-headed. But the Fixed Term Parliaments Act allows for, even in the event of the following day, Corbyn tabling a motion of no confidence and it being passed because you, sir, for the DUP, withdraw the confidence part of the confidence and supply agreement. Now, strangely enough, it happens to be Christmas Day or Boxing Day or what have you. But by Christmas, either she stands before Parliament to face another confidence vote, or you've put enough pressure on the Conservatives to say, number one, not May. Number two, we will pull the plug on the May bot, okay, by voting on the second occasion for the motion of no confidence. But my question for you is, will you, sir, nominate the next Conservative Prime Minister on the basis that, just as Churchill was appointed by Prime Minister by the monarch as the person who could command a majority. You can choose the person who will command a majority.
Of our party with 10 MPs in the House of Commons who are not members of the Conservative Party to dictate to any major party who their leader should be. As far as we're concerned, the only concern we have is that the policy of the party is the correct policy, and whoever delivers it is up to the Conservative Party. We would not be as arrogant as to say that.
Gentleman with the glasses. Yes, the correct.
John Strafford. Question for you, Daniel. After 55 years of Conservative Party membership, I don't believe in my lifetime I've witnessed such an incompetent, inefficient, unprincipled government as we have today. With a leader that shows no leadership whatsoever. And the gap between the Tory party hierarchy and the members is huge. 70% of party members wanted to leave the EU. 80% opposed the withdrawal agreement. 50% want to get rid of Theresa May, not by 22, but today. And the utter absurdity and obscenity of the party chairman sending out postcards to party members using party funds to get them to put pressure on their member of parliament to vote in favour of the withdrawal agreement takes the biscuit. Could you go back to your colleagues in parliament and say we need radical reform in the Tory party and then get back to conservatism?
What I would say is that when you say that this is the worst government, I think you've forgotten about the 1970 to 1974 Heath government, which actually took us into the EEC and actually lied to us in the process because they knew exactly what they were doing, quite frankly. Actually, we joined the European Economic Community on the day I was born, the 24th of January 1972. So we've been part of this for 46 years. Look, I mean, what's fascinating coming here this evening is just to see the palpable anger that you have and others have. And it's replicated in my own association. There are people who have serious misgivings as to what is happening at the moment in terms of the direction of travel, in the way that Mrs. May and the government are pursuing this, when they realise it is destabilising our government.
Yes.
And what we must all be focused on is if you think that WTO is going to be bad, which actually it's going to be very good, you should try a Corbyn government, which would be a cataclysm for this country's economy. So anything that pushes away the people who are helping us to remain in office and is destabilising the solidity and the unity of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is obviously very, very worrying. We will have to decide what happens after the December the 11th, but thank you very much for giving me your feedback.
We've had a very, very long session today, and we've gone on far beyond the normal time, because I know so many have wanted to put their points. But now I'd just like to thank these three speakers. They've shown great integrity, tremendous depth of analysis and passion, and we are all so grateful to them for coming here this evening and making their cases to us. Thank you so much.